In both Titanfall 1 and 2, Frontier Defense seemed more like Attack On side mode than a fully fledged experience. And for Attack On game mode, Frontier Defense is actually quite well done. Both games had some interesting mechanics, like Titanfall 1's burn cards and Titanfall 2's Aegis upgrades. But for Titanfall 3, I think that having a more fleshed out Frontier Defense game mode at launch is extremely important. In fact, I would go as far to say that I think that it should be at the very top of the priority list. The reason I say this is because Titanfall's multiplayer can seem really daunting to new players. Watching some of my friends and family trying Titanfall 2's multiplayer for the first time made me realize this, and unlike many other popular shooters, Titanfall's multiplayer takes quite a bit of time and effort to get good at. But at the same time, fans of the Titanfall experience love this about the game and don't want to see the skill and mastery taken out to appeal to less skilled players. This is where Frontier Defense comes in, giving players another mode they can play with their friends and learn the mechanics in a fun cooperative environment. It's also important to note that some people simply don't enjoy competitive multiplayer, and most of them probably wouldn't spend $60 for the campaign alone. For these players in particular, having an in-depth, addictive, and fun co-op mode will go a long way in justifying the cost. Ultimately, after Titanfall 2's poor sales, I think that bringing new players into the fold is one of the most important factors to consider, and having a quality cooperative mode at launch could really help out a lot in this department. But in terms of the actual gameplay, how would the experience innovate? In my opinion, one of the biggest changes that could be made to the game mode would be to expand the objective variety in meaningful ways. When I look back at cooperative multiplayer experiences that I've played over the years, there are a few highlights that stick out in my mind. Frontier Defense on Rise in Titanfall 1, the AC-130 co-op mission in Modern Warfare 2's Spec Ops mode, the Vault of Glass raid in Destiny, the heists in Grand Theft Auto, zombies in World at War and Black Ops, Mass Effect 3 multiplayer, and so many more. There's a ton of potential for cooperative gameplay, especially in a game with such a great sandbox like Titanfall. Of course, there could still be the classic Defend the Harvester missions like in Titanfall 1 and 2, as those missions are pretty fun as well. But only having Harvester Defense is a little bit uninspired for a fully fledged game mode in my opinion. Frontier Defense also feels a bit too much like a Titan exclusive mode, and I find that it doesn't really take advantage of the pilot aspect of Titanfall. For these reasons, I think that each individual Frontier Defense map should be treated as its own mission, rather than each map being an iteration of the same wave defense gameplay. Personally, I wouldn't mind if Respawn recycled areas of the campaign for use in Frontier Defense if it would make it easier for them to expand the mode. This would open up Frontier Defense to all sorts of interesting and creative mission designs, and I have a few ideas that I think would be interesting to explore. The first one is a mission where half of the players play as Titans and the other half play as pilots. The Titans would be limited to certain parts of the map due to their sheer size, but the pilots would be a lot more vulnerable and exposed. Both teams would need to help each other out in ways which only Titans or pilots could. The Titans could focus on taking out enemy Titans and Reapers, while the pilots could kill Rodeo Spectres and fetch batteries. The players would hold out against 5 increasingly difficult waves and have a limited pool of Titan and pilot lives. The last wave would culminate in a final boss fight, where players who are depleted of lives, ammo, and health would need to take on a final challenge. Another idea I had would be a pilots only mission slightly similar to Call of Duty's Zombies mode. Players would spawn with only a pistol and very limited ammo, and would need to hold out against waves of enemies. There would be a few terminals throughout the map where players could purchase ammo, ordnance, and other weapons with money they accumulate by killing enemies. How many rounds and enemies the player would need to fight through would be determined by the difficulty, along with the amount of lives the team has. An important thing to note about this mission idea in particular is that my version of Frontier Defense wouldn't allow you to pick up enemy weapons for reasons which I'll discuss later in this video. The last idea I have would be a sort of arena-style mission inspired by the combat simulation dome in the campaign mission Into the Abyss. Instead of this mission having a set of lives, it would have a timer which counts down, and the objective of the mission would be to survive until the timer reaches 0. If a player dies, they cannot respawn. At various timed intervals, new enemies would be deployed and terrain would shift to change up the gameplay. Increasing the difficulty would extend the timer and drop harder enemies into the dome. These are just 3 ideas that I thought of off the top of my head, and I have no idea if they would work well. But I hope they illustrate my point that there are a lot of creative opportunities that Respawn could take advantage of. I've even considered what a Titanfall raid might look like, but that's probably way too large in scope and scale. Of course, I'm sure that some of you might have some pretty cool Frontier Defense mission ideas, and I would love to hear them down in the comments section. Another interesting idea that I've been mulling over in my head is the inclusion of secondary objectives. This idea was somewhat inspired by Mass Effect 3's multiplayer mode, where every 3rd, 6th, and 10th round would have a certain objective like assassinating certain enemies or hacking terminals. In Mass Effect 3, these objectives were requirements and you would fail a mission if you didn't complete them. However, in Frontier Defense, I think it would be better if these were just optional side objectives for some extra points and credits. As for what these objectives could be, I think things like shooting down enemy dropships, capturing hardpoints, or destroying an enemy harvester would be a few interesting ideas. Another small but important point is in regards to the enemy AI. In Titanfall 2's campaign, the AI isn't particularly intelligent, but in Frontier Defense, it's on a whole new level entirely. This is probably due to the fact that Frontier Defense was a DLC update for Titanfall 1 and 2, and not a fully fleshed out experience. It was most likely much easier for Respawn to throw a harvester on some multiplayer maps, then they could get enemies to mindlessly run at it rather than program them to properly react to the players, and for a DLC mode this works well enough to be enjoyable. But with my more mission-focused Frontier Defense idea, I think it's extremely important the AI is on par with the AI in the campaign. I don't think Titanfall is the type of game that needs a particularly intelligent AI, as its movement and sandbox is mechanically rich enough to entertain players. But at the same time, I can't really say that the AI in Frontier Defense is all that interesting to interact with, and I think it could certainly use a bit of a boost. Lastly, I want to touch on scoring and difficulty settings. These may seem like small details, but I actually think that for a co-op mode in particular, much of the replayability is derived from these options. I often find myself feeling quite disappointed with difficulty options in games, as they rarely strike a good balance or make the game more mechanically demanding. Jumping from heroic to legendary in Halo, or from hard to master in Titanfall 2 feels extremely jarring and punishing in a way which I feel takes away from the experience rather than adding to it. This is all part of a much larger conversation about the difference between difficulty and challenge in games, which is a bit too complex to discuss here and probably deserves its own video entirely. But to summarize my thoughts on the subject, challenge refers to how much thought you need to put into overcoming obstacles, while difficulty refers to how hard it is to pull off those thought processes. In my opinion, difficulty options in games need to balance both of these elements, and I actually think that Titanfall 2's Frontier Defense does a pretty good job in this regard. Changes like shielded grunts and stalkers wielding EPGs are much more interesting than just increasing enemy health and damage. Don't get me wrong, I think increasing enemy health and damage has its place, but when these are the only changes that a new difficulty offers, it just feels cheap and uninspired. For Frontier Defense in Titanfall 3, I would love if increasing the difficulty made some really interesting changes that affect player strategy. You could still have your standard changes like enemy health and damage, number of waves, number of enemies, time limit changes, enemy types, number of lives, etc. But Respawn could also include changes like enemy weapons, regenerating shields, enemy accuracy, enemy projectile speed, enemy movement speed, enemy ability usage, Titan build time, and many more. Playing on easy might have the player fighting against waves of low health enemies that deal low damage with low accuracy while having unlimited lives and regenerating Titan shields. But on hard difficulty, players would be fighting enemies with more powerful weapons, fired with more accuracy, with faster moving projectiles, regenerating Titan shields, and sprinting towards the objective, while the players themselves would be under a time limit with only one life each. Personally, I think this would be a lot more interesting and engaging, and would give each new difficulty a whole new layer of challenge. In addition to difficulty settings, players could also choose to enable optional challenge modifiers. These would be kind of similar to Skulls in Halo or the Strike modifiers in Destiny. These modifiers would further increase the challenge by adding additional debuffs to your team or additional buffs to your enemies. Some ideas I thought of could be toxicity, where the ground layer of the map is covered in the toxic sludge featured in the mission Blood and Rust. Another could be Death Ball, where a large ball of electric smoke slowly moves throughout the level, dealing damage to players inside of it and forcing them to move. Or maybe a Titan Focus modifier which limits each player to only one Titanfall per match. Maybe a Pilot modifier where the health regeneration rate is massively decreased. If secondary objectives are included, maybe there could be a modifier which requires players to complete them within a certain time limit or else they would fail the mission. Or maybe another modifier which reduces how much reserve ammo players could carry. There are all sorts of different interesting modifiers that Respawn could play around with to really liven up the gameplay in unique ways, and I think these would add a lot of replayability to the mode. Now with difficulty settings and modifiers would come scoring and rewards. Each mission would have different point milestones that players would be trying to achieve. These milestones would be bronze, silver, gold, platinum, and diamond. Each of these milestones would be reached when players have collectively earned a certain amount of points. For example, bronze might require 5,000 points, silver might require 7,500 points, gold might require 15,000 points, platinum might require 30,000 points, and diamond might require 50,000 points. This is just a rough example to illustrate the idea, and I imagine the point requirements would have to be adjusted for each mission independently. Anyways, points would be awarded for killing enemies, getting medals, playing the objective, completing the mission within a certain time, and other factors that I can't think of off the top of my head. Then, depending on the difficulty level you play, your team would receive a point multiplier. This could be as simple as half points for playing on easy, no multiplier for playing on normal, double points for playing on hard, and triple points for playing on master. Each challenge modifier you have active would also grant a bonus to your multiplier, with the extent of this bonus being determined by how much that particular modifier affects gameplay. At the end of the game, or when your team has failed, players will be awarded a sum of credits and some Frontier Defense specific currency, which I will refer to as FDC. How much FDC your team will be awarded is determined by which milestone you reach, with some bonus FDC being awarded for completing secondary objectives. Reaching the bronze milestone may only award 500 FDC, while reaching the gold milestone may award 5,000 FDC. It's important to note that the entire squad will receive the same amount of FDC, regardless of their performance. While players who perform better than others would receive more credits than players who performed worse, they wouldn't receive extra FDC. This is done to ensure that the experience always remains cooperative in nature and doesn't devolve into players blatantly kill-stealing to fast-track the progression, while everyone else receives little to no reward. As for what players would use their FDC to buy, I think it's time to move on to the next section of this video. Loadout customization in Frontier Defense wouldn't be too different from loadout customization in multiplayer. However, your multiplayer progression wouldn't carry over to Frontier Defense, and both game modes would have completely separate progression, like what Black Ops 4 does in its Zombies mode. This is primarily done because of the introduction of FDC, as well as making Frontier Defense a more replayable mode that encourages players to return. To unlock Titans, attachments, kits, and so on, players would need to spend their FDC. Frontier Defense would also have a few exclusive customization options since it's a cooperative mode and isn't weighed down by competitive requirements. This means that new additions, which would normally be game-breaking or simply unfit for a competitive environment, could be added to Frontier Defense. This could be anything really, from new weapon attachments to Titan kits. For example, since players would have limited ammo and couldn't pick up enemy weapons, a new weapon attachment or pilot kit which increases reserve ammo capacity could be added as a customization option. Or maybe a new tactical ability which drops an ammo crate on the ground could be added as well. It's also important to note that the functionality of certain kits, titans, abilities, or really anything may need to be slightly adjusted to properly fit into Frontier Defense. For example, the Ordnance Expert kit may need to be changed so that it allows you to carry more grenades, rather than decreasing recharge time as grenades are no longer unlimited. Or maybe Tesla's EMP core could be modified to disable Arc Titan's electric chassis and prevent Nuke Titans from detonating. Another new part of loadout customization that's exclusive to Frontier Defense would be the reintroduction of burn cards from Titanfall 1. Players would have a total of 6 burn card slots, 3 passive and 3 active. Passive burn cards would apply a general buff to the player for the entirety of their next Frontier Defense mission, while active burn cards would need to be activated by the player at their discretion. Each of these 3 active and passive slots would be dedicated to a different type of burn card. One would be a weapon slot, another would be a Titan slot, and the last one would be a pilot slot. Burn cards could only be placed in their respective slots so that players couldn't stack multiple of the same type of burn card. This would prevent players from mixing a particular set of burn cards together to make themselves extremely overpowered to a game-breaking degree. Like burn cards in Titanfall 1, Frontier Defense burn cards would be consumed when used. Players would need to frequently resupply on burn cards if they planned on playing the harder missions, which could be done by purchasing burn card packs with FDC. In addition to the random burn card packs, there would also be an assortment of burn cards which could be purchased individually, with this assortment changing each week. Now this next part is going to be a tough conversation, so let me first begin by saying that I personally do not like the idea of loot boxes in games. Please do not mistake what I'm about to say as an endorsement of loot boxes. I'm merely bringing this up in case loot boxes must be included in Titanfall 3. Personally, I think real money loot boxes for burn cards in Frontier Defense would be better than loot boxes ruining the competitive nature of multiplayer, or loot boxes completely gutting cosmetic progression. Once again, I'm approaching this from the perspective of if loot boxes must be included in Titanfall 3. There is a chance that including real money loot boxes won't be Respawn's choice, and I'm simply pitching this idea because I think it would be the least intrusive in comparison to other types of loot boxes. There's a lot more that I could say about loot boxes in video games, but as someone who plans on getting into the gaming industry, I honestly feel that I need to be very careful about what I say when it comes to criticizing monetization methods. What I just said may even be pushing it a bit too far, but I'm not going to flat out lie to the people watching this video about where I stand on the issue. Moving on to something more positive, I have a few ideas for both passive and active burn cards which I think could be interesting. The first is a passive weapon burn card called Armor Piercing Rounds, which would significantly increase the damage that primary and secondary weapons deal to Titan and minion weak points. This would be an excellent card to use when playing a higher level mission where ammo is scarce and enemies have a high amount of health. Another somewhat similar type of passive weapon burn card would be Arc Rounds. This would cause your primary and secondary weapons to deal increased damage to enemy particle walls and Titan shields, and would stun mechanical minions like Spectres, Stalkers, and Reapers. A good passive Titan burn card would be Dash Quick Charger, which would make your dashes regenerate much faster. This would be really useful for large maps that require you to move around a lot in your Titan. Another interesting passive burn card would actually be Tactikill. This would take up the pilot slot and would take off 5% of your tactical ability recharge time for every kill that you get. For active burn cards, there could be some basic ones like Amped Weapons or the Smart Pistol in the weapons slot, but one that I think would be really cool would be a Reaper team. I guess this would be in the pilot slot, and upon activation, a squad of 3 Reapers would drop onto the battlefield and defend a location. These would be really awesome for padding your damage output against waves of enemies, as well as drawing enemy fire. Nuclear Eject could also come back as an active Titan burn card, and I don't really think I need to explain why this one would be useful. These are just a few ideas though, and once again, if you have some of your own ideas, feel free to drop a comment. In my opinion, progression and reward systems are integral to the success of most cooperative horde modes. A good progression system can really go a long ways in adding a lot of replayability to the experience, as it gives players some goals to strive towards. If I think back to other co-op modes that I played over the years, I'd probably say that my favorite thus far is Mass Effect 3's multiplayer. Even to this day, I still log on and play ME3's multiplayer once in a while, since it's a ton of fun and I'm nowhere close to unlocking everything in the game. For those who haven't played it, Mass Effect 3's multiplayer pits a team of 4 players against 10 waves of enemies. Each new wave increases in difficulty as more dangerous enemies are deployed on the field in greater numbers. On the 3rd, 6th, and 10th wave, players are tasked with completing a random side objective, which can actually be pretty tough at times. After the 10th wave has been completed, an evac phase would begin where players must make it back to a landing zone and hold out against the final wave of enemies. It isn't a particularly complex or innovative horde mode by any means, and at the launch of Mass Effect 3, many people didn't really think it was all that great. It was after all the free DLC updates that Mass Effect 3's multiplayer really started to get good. What was special about Mass Effect 3's multiplayer wasn't really the mission design, but rather the excellent progression and character building options. After all the interesting weapons and characters were introduced, this aspect of the game really encouraged both playstyle variety through various different character ability sets, and replayability through unlocking new pieces of gear. And as players acquire more powerful characters and gear, they would have a better chance of completing the higher difficulties, which have a much larger payout. This created a fairly simple but addictive gameplay loop that kept me coming back for many more hours than I ever expected. The good thing about Frontier Defense is that Respawn has already implemented similar features through the Aegis Titan ranks in Titanfall 2. The only issue with Aegis ranks is that this form of progression didn't last long enough, and ultimately, playing Frontier Defense never really rewarded me with anything that I wanted. But with the introduction of FTC, as well as the increased value of credits that I've proposed for Titanfall 3, I think Frontier Defense could remedy this issue, with credits being used to acquire cosmetic unlocks, and FTC being used to acquire gear for Frontier Defense. As I stated earlier, FTC could be used to purchase items like weapons, titans, attachments, kits, and pretty much every other standard unlockable in the game, as well as burn card packs. However, I personally don't think that this would be enough, and many players would quickly burn through all of these unlocks. This is where the Aegis upgrades come back into play. In addition to purchasing the items themselves, players could also spend their FTC to unlock new Aegis upgrades. But Aegis upgrades wouldn't just be for Titans, and could also be purchased for every other customization option. Everything from weapons to kits to Titans could have their own set of upgrades, which would give players a plethora of unlocks to grind for and spend their FTC on. This is also why I think that players shouldn't be able to pick up enemy weapons, and instead should replenish their ammo reserves and grenades from ammo crates on the map. With each weapon having a set of unique upgrades, players probably wouldn't want to drop it on the ground, and would rather replenish their ammo instead. Now, I fully know that this would be a massive amount of content for Respawn to make, which may seem unfeasible. This is why I think that for most items in the game, each Aegis upgrade should only be statistical changes, as these are far easier and less time consuming to implement. I also think that there should only be 5 Aegis upgrades per item to lessen the workload for Respawn. Pilot weapons, Titan weapons, and Titans themselves could still have some interesting and unique upgrades, but for items like attachments, kits, and tactical abilities, I don't think this would be entirely necessary. Additionally, when the player unlocks all of the Aegis ranks for a particular item, they could choose to level it up. This would provide minor stat boosts like plus 5% damage, range, and stability for the R201, or using Stim increases pilot health by 10%. Each item would have 10 levels, but when you level up that item, you would lose all your Aegis upgrades on it. Players would then need to acquire more FTC and purchase all their Aegis ranks again. However, each item level would also increase the cost of Aegis ranks. As players acquire and upgrade new items, they become much more powerful, making it a bit easier to complete higher difficulties. These higher difficulties would enable players to reach higher milestones, which would have a higher payout. Players with level 1 gear with little or no Aegis upgrades may only be capable of playing on easy and earning bronze tier, but players with level 8 or 9 gear with most or all Aegis upgrades may be capable of playing on master with challenge modifiers activated, allowing them to reach gold or platinum tier. The ultimate challenge would be to reach diamond tier, which would require players to play on the highest difficulty with all challenge modifiers activated. This would give players a massive FTC and credit payout, along with unlocking an exclusive cosmetic item to show off. Maybe this item could be a banner which displays the amount of times you've reached the diamond milestone. To end this video off, I'll give a few examples of what I think could be some interesting Aegis upgrades. For weapons, there could be some generic upgrades that could apply to really any weapon in the game, like an extra attachment slot or increased weak point damage. But in terms of upgrades for specific weapons, one weapon I think could have some interesting unlocks would be the Devotion. An upgrade which increases the ramp-up speed and stability could be fairly useful, and another upgrade which causes the Devotion to have no magazine, but an overheat system could also be really awesome. Another interesting weapon to play around with would be the Archer Missile. An upgrade which allows you to fire 2 missiles before reloading, or another upgrade which allows you to instantly lock on to any target could be fun to play around with. Another idea that popped up in my head would be an upgrade for the Cold War, which causes it to fire cryo rounds that create icy vapor over the projectile splash zone. And because I'm absolutely in love with the gun Bad Juju from Destiny, an upgrade for the Hemlock which fires full auto bursts with increased ability, and another upgrade which causes kills to automatically refill your magazine just needs to happen. Titanfall 3 plus Bad Juju equals Game of the Year. Make it happen, Respawn. Jokes aside, for Titans, some generic upgrades could be things like increased core meter gains or an additional Titan kit. With Ion in particular, some of the Aegis upgrades from Titanfall 2 could make their way back into Titanfall 3, like the one which increases Ion's total energy pool, or the upgrade that extends laser core whenever you get a kill with it. For Northstar, an upgrade which increases critical hit damage, or another upgrade that cloaks you while you're using hover could be interesting. These are just ideas off the top of my head, and I'm sure that you guys have some of your own as well. But that pretty much covers everything I have to say about Frontier Defense. I know that this is a pretty massive expansion to the mode, and many of you will tell me that it's unfeasible to expect this much content. That's an absolutely fair and valid criticism, and one that I completely understand. But even if only a quarter of these ideas were implemented in some way or another, I think it would be enough to really flesh out the Frontier Defense experience and make it the fully fledged mode we all know it could be. I also feel that it's important to state once again that this video series contains my idea for what I personally think would be the best Titanfall 3, not necessarily the most realistic Titanfall 3. Once again, I want to thank each and every one of you for watching this video, and I hope to see you all in my next and final episode covering single player and the Titanfall universe.
Listen up.